What if the meat pie in your freezer isn't actually a meat pie in the way you think it is? Not the slow-baked, flaky, meat-heavy comfort food people imagine, but something engineered to survive warehouses, microwaves, and months of shelf life. Most shoppers never question it. The box shows a golden crust cracking open. Steam rises. A fork lifts thick chunks of beef swimming in gravy. Your brain fills in the rest of the story before you even read the ingredients. But over the last 20 years, the frozen aisle has quietly changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. Brands kept their names. They kept the nostalgia. What changed was the balance inside the pie. How much real meat, how much thickener, how much water, and how much engineering it takes to create something that feels comforting even when the structure underneath is completely different from a traditional meat pie. I didn't realize this at first either. It only becomes obvious when you start comparing labels side by side. Some pies feel heavy before you even heat them. Others feel strangely light, almost hollow. Some fillings hold together like a stew wrapped in pastry, while others dissolve into a salty sauce within minutes. Once you notice the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. And one of the most surprising places to start is with a brand people still associate with homemade comfort. Marie Callender's sells a feeling more than a product. The brand language leans into kitchen tables, slow cooking, and recipes that feel like they came from a family bakery rather than a production line. That image is powerful, especially because many people remember when frozen pot pies actually felt heavier and more meat-forward. But recent consumer reviews and food rankings often highlight a different reality. Complaints about rubbery beef cubes, thinner fillings, and crusts that soften too quickly have become common. The interesting part isn't that the product suddenly became bad. It's how subtle shifts in formulation change the experience without most people realizing why. Look at the filling structure. Traditional meat pies rely on chunks of meat and natural fats to create body. Many modern frozen versions rely more heavily on thickened gravy, starches, modified food ingredients, and stabilizers that help the pie look full even when the actual meat density is lower than expected. When heated, that sauce expands, creating the illusion of abundance. At first bite, it feels comforting because salt and seasoning hit quickly. But the texture fades faster than people remember. That's not nostalgia playing tricks, it's formulation design. The brand still markets the idea of home-style baking, yet the internal balance between meat, liquid, and thickener has shifted toward efficiency. Most shoppers never flip the box over to check ingredient order. They trust the name, and that trust does most of the work. If Marie Callender's leans on nostalgia, Banquet leans on price. And that changes everything about how the pie is built. Banquet pot pies are famous for being cheap, fast, and easy to find. There's nothing hidden about that positioning. But the ingredient strategy reveals how manufacturers stretch a product while still delivering something that feels satisfying enough to buy again. Banquet pies often use smaller meat pieces suspended in a gravy that carries most of the flavor. Sodium levels tend to be higher because salt enhances taste even when the meat itself is less prominent. The crust browns quickly, giving a visual cue of quality even if the filling underneath is lighter than expected. One of the most fascinating parts of Banquet's success is how expectations shape perception. People don't expect a luxury product, so they judge it differently. That allows the brand to lean into aggressive cost optimization. Thinner pastry layers, fillings that prioritize sauce over solid meat, and ingredients designed to hold texture during freezing and reheating. Some food writers have pointed out that mechanically processed meats and fillers appear more often in ultra-budget frozen meals, which helps explain why the texture can feel softer or more uniform than a traditional pie. But the strategy works because it delivers immediate comfort at a low price. The question isn't whether Banquet fulfills its promise, it does. The real question is whether most viewers realize how far removed it is from the dense, meat-heavy pies that inspired the category in the first place. Swanson lives in the middle ground, and that middle ground is where things get interesting. It isn't positioned as ultra-cheap like Banquet, and it doesn't lean as heavily into home-style nostalgia as Marie Callender's. Instead, it presents itself as a reliable classic, something familiar that quietly blends convenience with comfort. Many comparisons rank Swanson above budget pies because the fillings can feel slightly more structured and the seasoning less aggressive. But when you look deeper, you start to notice how the texture is carefully engineered for microwave convenience rather than traditional baking. Real pastry has resistance. It flakes. It takes time to soften. Many frozen pies, including Swanson, are designed to heat evenly and quickly, which means the dough formula often prioritizes flexibility over structure. That's why the crust can feel softer and more uniform. Inside, ground or finely processed meat mixtures help distribute flavor evenly through the gravy. From a manufacturing standpoint, this is incredibly efficient. Smaller meat pieces freeze more consistently and reheat without drying out. From a storytelling standpoint, though, it changes the identity of the pie. Instead of a pastry wrapped around a hearty stew, the pie becomes a delivery system for a sauce that tastes rich even when the meat content feels lighter than expected. It's not necessarily a flaw. It's a different philosophy, one built around speed and consistency rather than the slow, dense feel of a bakery-style pie. Hungry Man built its identity around appetite. Big portions, bold flavors, a promise that you won't leave the table hungry. That positioning shapes everything about how their meat-focused meals are constructed. When a pie or turnover appears under the Hungry Man label, the goal isn't delicate pastry or slow-simmered filling. It's volume and impact. You see it immediately in the sodium numbers and the way the gravy behaves once heated. The sauce thickens aggressively, clinging to every bite so the flavor hits fast and strong. That intensity isn't accidental. High salt and dense seasoning allow manufacturers to maintain flavor even when ingredients need to withstand freezing, reheating, and long transport times. The interesting part is how perception works here. People expect indulgence, so they rarely question the texture. A softer crust or heavily thickened filling feels consistent with the brand's identity. But if you compare it to a traditional meat pie, you notice the difference quickly. Classic pies rely on natural fats from meat to create richness. Many industrial versions rely on starches and stabilizers to create body instead. That means the filling can feel heavy at first bite, yet strangely uniform. Less like chunks of beef or chicken in gravy, more like a carefully blended mixture designed to deliver maximum flavor in every forkful. Hungry Man doesn't pretend to be artisanal, and that honesty makes it popular. The trade-off is that the structure of the pie becomes secondary to the idea of sheer quantity. Boston Market carries a completely different emotional weight. The brand name alone suggests rotisserie ovens, warm lights, and cafeteria-style comfort food that feels closer to a restaurant than a freezer aisle. That image matters because it creates an expectation of freshness, even when the product is frozen. When you open one of their pot pies, the visual presentation often delivers on that promise. Golden crust, visible vegetables, thick gravy. But once you start paying attention to texture, you notice something subtle. The filling tends to lean heavily on sauce rather than solid meat density, and the crust can soften quickly after heating. This isn't necessarily a flaw, it's a design choice. Frozen pies must balance moisture carefully. Too much real meat without enough liquid, and the filling dries out during reheating. Too much liquid, and the crust loses structure. Boston Market often leans toward a smoother, more uniform gravy to ensure consistency across batches. Some reviewers mention that the flavor feels familiar, but slightly muted compared to what they remember from restaurant meals. That's the compromise of scaling comfort food into a product that can sit in a freezer for months. The brand's storytelling emphasizes home-style cooking, yet the internal engineering prioritizes reliability. A pie that tastes roughly the same every time, even if it sacrifices some of the rustic feel people expect from the name. Great value pot pies don't hide what they are. They exist to be affordable, accessible, and easy to prepare. And for many families, that matters more than anything else. But when you start reading ingredient lists, you begin to see how price shapes formulation. Water and broth often play a larger role than consumers assume, helping create volume without dramatically increasing cost. That's why these pies can feel surprisingly light before cooking. The filling expands as it heats, giving the impression of a full portion, even though the actual meat content may be modest. The texture tells the rest of the story. Because the filling relies heavily on thickened liquids, it can shift from firm to soupy quickly if overheated. Stabilizers and gums help maintain consistency, preventing ice crystals from forming during freezing and keeping the gravy smooth after reheating. None of this is inherently negative. It's simply the reality of producing a low-cost frozen meal at scale. The important detail for viewers is understanding that price often reflects ingredient strategy. When a pie costs a fraction of premium options, something has to change behind the scenes. In many cases, that something is density, less solid meat, more structured sauce, and a crust designed to cook fast rather than hold firm. Hot Pockets sit in a strange category because they don't always look like traditional pies, yet they follow many of the same engineering principles. Instead of a round pastry shell, you get a folded turnover, a sealed pocket of dough built for microwaves. The design prioritizes speed above everything else. The dough formula is created to stay soft after rapid heating, which means it behaves differently than classic pastry. Inside, fillings often rely on processed meats, cheeses, and sauces that can maintain texture without drying out. The reason Hot Pockets belong in this conversation is the way they redefine what people think a meat pie is supposed to feel like. Younger viewers who grew up eating microwave turnovers might associate that soft, stretchy texture with comfort. But historically, meat pies were dense, flaky, and slightly resistant when you bit into them. Hot Pockets remove that resistance entirely. The experience becomes smooth, uniform, almost engineered to disappear quickly. That isn't a coincidence. It's the result of decades of product development focused on convenience. And while the brand never claims to be traditional, its popularity shows how easily the definition of a pie can evolve when speed becomes the primary goal. Mr. Pasty is one of the more complicated names in the frozen pie world because it started from a genuinely traditional idea. Cornish pasties were originally simple, heavy pastries filled with meat and vegetables. Portable meals built for miners and workers who needed something filling and durable. When the brand first gained attention, that heritage gave it a sense of authenticity that many frozen products lacked. But as distribution expanded and production scaled, consistency became harder to maintain. Some batches feel dense and satisfying, while others lean softer and more processed, depending on how the filling is balanced. What makes Mr. Pasty interesting is how it reveals the tension between tradition and industrialization. The original concept relies on minimal ingredients and sturdy pastry. Large-scale manufacturing, however, requires predictability, fillings that freeze evenly, dough that reheats without cracking, seasoning that tastes the same across thousands of units. That push for uniformity can slowly shift the texture away from what made the original pies special. It doesn't mean the brand abandoned its roots. It means that scaling a handcrafted idea into a national frozen product inevitably changes the experience in subtle ways most consumers never consciously notice. By this point, a pattern should be forming. The difference between a traditional meat pie and a heavily engineered frozen version isn't always obvious from the front of the box. It shows up in details most shoppers skip. Start with ingredient order. Ingredients are listed by weight, so if water, broth, or thickening agents appear before meat, the filling is likely more sauce-driven than meat-driven. Lift the pie before you buy it. Density matters. Real meat and solid pastry weigh more than air and liquid. Watch how the crust behaves after cooking. A classic pastry flakes and hold shape even when cut. Engineered dough often softens quickly, bending rather than breaking. Pay attention to fats as well. Traditional pies rely heavily on animal fats, butter, beef fat, or chicken fat, to create richness. Many frozen versions use vegetable oils because they're more stable during freezing and shipping. That doesn't automatically make a pie bad, but it changes the mouthfeel. And finally, observe how the filling melts once it cools. Real meat pies thicken naturally as they sit. Highly processed fillings can separate or become watery because the structure comes from added starches rather than the meat itself. Blake's feels different before you even take a bite. Pick up the pie and it actually has weight to it, and that's the first clue. Instead of relying on a heavy gravy to create the illusion of fullness, Blake's leans more on real ingredients doing the work themselves. When you cut into one, the filling doesn't rush out like soup. It holds shape. You can see distinct pieces of chicken or beef instead of everything blending into one uniform texture. That difference usually comes down to formulation choices. Many frozen pies are built to heat fast, which means softer doughs and thinner fillings. Blake's takes a slightly slower approach. The crust behaves more like real pastry. A little firmer, a little flakier, and the seasoning feels calmer because the base ingredients carry more flavor on their own. Some reviewers even mention that it tastes less aggressively salty than mainstream brands, which is often a sign that the pie isn't relying on sodium to compensate for missing richness. It's still a frozen product, but it respects the structure of what a meat pie is supposed to feel like: dense, grounded, and built around the filling rather than the sauce. Boomerang stands out because it doesn't follow the typical American frozen pie formula. Instead of chasing softness and oversized portions, it leans into an Australian-style approach where the pastry and filling feel tighter and more controlled. The crust holds together when you pick it up. It doesn't collapse immediately. That alone changes the eating experience. Inside, the meat filling feels more cohesive. Not tiny fragments floating in gravy, but something closer to a traditional handheld pie. The seasoning isn't overpowering, which lets the texture become the main character. That might sound small, but it's rare in the frozen aisle, where many brands push bold flavors to distract from lighter fillings. What makes Boomerangs interesting is how it resets expectations. If you're used to soft microwave pies, this feels almost old-fashioned. Heavier, firmer, more deliberate. It proves that frozen convenience doesn't automatically mean sacrificing structure. The American meat pie aisle didn't suddenly change. It slowly optimized itself. More sauce, softer crusts, faster cooking times. Packaging stayed nostalgic while the inside became more efficient. That's why so many people feel like something is off without knowing exactly what changed. Once you know what to look for, the difference becomes obvious. Heavier pies tend to rely more on real filling. Shorter ingredient lists usually mean fewer tricks. A crust that holds its shape tells you the dough wasn't designed only for speed. None of this is about labeling brands as good or bad. It's about understanding how modern food manufacturing works so you can choose intentionally. And the moment you start comparing pies side by side, the illusion fades. Some are built to look comforting. Others are built to actually feel like a real meat pie. The only difference is whether you know how to spot it.